It is that two shall become one. In other words, to sum it up in one word, it's union or unity. What I want to say to you is that unity is godlike. The ultimate, the original, the only perfect pattern of unity is found in the Godhead. The Father and the Son are one. Not one person, but one in union through the Holy Spirit. And in a certain sense, what God is aiming at in marriage is that a man and a woman will achieve this most godlike of all achievements, true union, true unity. But the way to it is the way that God has laid down. And there is no other way into the kind of union which God desires in marriage but God's way. The next truth that I have to bring to you follows immediately from what I've already said. The end purpose of marriage is union, and union in turn leads to knowing. This is a thought that it's possibly difficult for people in our culture to understand because we've got such an intellectual concept of what knowing is. But in the original language of Scripture, the word know had a much deeper meaning than merely knowing facts. In the book of Genesis, chapter 4 and verse 1, immediately after the description of man's fall and its consequences, the next chapter opens with this statement: Adam knew Eve, his wife. Now, the modern translations tend to use some phrase like Adam had relations with his wife. Of course, that's correct in the sense that it describes what happens. But the King James Version actually is more faithful to the original text at this point, and it brings out that what God is aiming at is knowing. Of course, between a husband and a wife, that includes a sexual relationship. But merely to limit it to a sexual relationship is completely to miss the purpose of God. That's why, in a certain sense, I'd rather stay with the King James translation, Adam knew his wife. It was not merely sexual. Now, in the language of the Old Testament, there are two distinct phrases used. One says a man knew a woman. The other says a man lay with a woman. And the Bible is very discriminating as to how it uses those phrases. In my talk tomorrow, I'm going to explain the implication of the difference. But what I just want to impress upon you today is that the end purpose of God in marriage, through union, is that a man and a woman truly know one another. What's involved? The more I meditate on this, the more deep and wonderful it seems to me. In Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 36 and 37, Jesus speaks about the worth of a human soul. And he says, in effect, one human soul is worth more than the whole universe. Now, I believe that. I believe there is no way to measure the value of a single human soul. So what is it that happens in marriage? Marriage, as planned by God, opens the way for two human souls to know each other to their innermost depths in every area of their lives, physical, mental, emotional, cultural. It's the union of two persons, not just two bodies, nor just two minds. Some people put all the emphasis on sex, some put it all on the intellect. But in God's purpose, it's total, a total knowing by one person of another. I speak from the background of a very happy marriage that lasted 30 years. And in my personal judgment, there is no greater privilege in life than to be permitted to know another person this way. The second point about God's provision of marriage is that by insisting on a covenant and commitment as the way into that marriage, He has provided protection from each party from being exploited or betrayed. Let me say frankly that any woman who allows herself to be sexually exploited by a man, to have sexual relationships with a man without that man first making a covenant commitment, she is really prostituting her personality. I'm not just talking in terms of sexual morality, but I'm saying that in actual fact that woman is desecrating the most precious thing that she has, her personality. She's exposing her whole personality to someone who's not willing to pay the price that God requires. It's the same with a man. A man is doing the same when he has relations with a woman, but there's no commitment. There's no covenant. The purpose of marriage is this deep, ongoing, intimate, personal relationship protected by commitment. This relationship should be continually deeper and richer as the marriage continues. I look back on my own first marriage, and I think that over 30 years, Lydia and I were continually coming to know one another more deeply and more intimately. Our marriage grew richer and fuller the longer it lasted. There was never an anticlimax. I think sometimes we would sit and travel in the car together maybe an hour without speaking. And then when we'd both begin to speak simultaneously, we'd start talking about exactly the same thing. In other words, the relationship just didn't depend on verbal communion, nor did it depend merely on sexual relationship, but it was a total knowing of one person by another. Yesterday I spoke about the end purpose of marriage, union that leads to knowing. I explained that the end purpose of God in ordaining marriage is to allow two persons to know one another to the innermost depth of their total personality. That it's not merely a physical relationship or an emotional one or an intellectual one, but it's two persons knowing each other in all their fullness. And I said also that human personality is the most precious and wonderful thing created in the universe. And so God has set very careful boundaries so that one person may know another but never exploit another. And those who ignore these boundaries and try to get the benefits without meeting the conditions are deceiving themselves. They're being cheated. So today I'm going to speak about the opposite side of this theme. Counterfeits that cheat us. Human substitutes for marriage that do not produce God's results. First, let me point out to you that people only counterfeit things that are valuable. And this applies to marriage. If it weren't so valuable, there'd be no counterfeits. When the Old Testament speaks about a man having sexual relationship with a woman, it uses two distinct phrases. Some places it says, the man knew the woman. In other places it says, the man lay with the woman. If you care to trace this, you'll see that there's a very careful distinction maintained. The Bible only says that a man knew a woman if the relationship was legitimate, if it was in line with God's ordinance for sexual relationship between a man and a woman, if it was based on a covenant commitment. But if a man merely had sexual relationship with a woman without making a covenant commitment to her, it does not say that the man knew the woman. It only says he lay with her. And I believe that this contains a deep truth, that God does not open the way for that kind of interpersonal relationship where one person truly knows another unless it is preceded by covenant commitment. There can be a physical relationship, there can be some kind of sexual pleasure, but the real purpose of marriage, the deep inner knowing of two persons, one of the other, is possible only on the basis of covenant commitment. Let me read to you what it says in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers God will judge. I want to point out to you that that's a statement that cannot be challenged. God is going to judge fornicators and adulterers. Let me explain to you simply the difference in this context between fornication and adultery. Fornication is having sexual relationship without a covenant commitment. It's more or less promiscuous sex. But adultery is what happens when a person has made a covenant commitment in marriage and then breaks the commitment by having a relationship with someone outside the marriage. Of the two sins, adultery is a greater sin than fornication, because it's the breaking of that most sacred thing, a covenant. But in each case, the sin consists in the wrong attitude to covenant commitment. One is trying to get the relationship without the covenant commitment. The other is making a covenant commitment and then breaking it. I want you to understand that God's requirements are designed to protect us from being hurt. And any person who indulges in illegitimate sex is desecrating or violating his or her own personality. And the end of that, ultimately, is not satisfaction, it's not joy, it's not peace, it is frustration and hurt. Listen to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Flee immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. I don't believe that merely means that a person who indulges in promiscuous sex is liable to get venereal disease, though that is one aspect. But I believe that a person who indulges in illegitimate sex is misusing and abusing his own body. And I believe our bodies protest against that misuse, and that there are results in our total personality which come from the abusing of the sexual relationship. We sometimes speak about people breaking God's laws. I want you to understand that that's not accurate. We never break God's laws. God's laws break us. This is true in the physical realm. No one ever yet broke the law of gravity. A person can step out of a fourth-floor window. What happens? They don't break the law of gravity. The law of gravity breaks them. And that's exactly how it is in this matter of sexual relationships. We don't break God's laws. God's laws break us. The essence of lust is using a human personality as a means, not appreciating the personality in itself, but simply exploiting it for some other purpose. Now, God never deals with human personality in this way. God always respects the personality that he himself created. I want to read you two vivid descriptions of what lust is and what it does. The first is taken from the Bible. The second will be taken from a well-known secular author. The Bible passage is in Proverbs chapter 7, verses 6 through 27, and I'm reading from the Living Bible. I was looking out the window of my house one day and saw a simple-minded lad, a young man lacking common sense, walking at twilight down the street to the house of this wayward girl, a prostitute. She approached him, saucy and pert and dressed seductively. She was the brash, coarse type, seen often in the streets and markets, soliciting at every corner for men to be her lovers. She put her arms around him and kissed him, and with a saucy look she said, "I've decided to forget our quarrel. I was just coming to look for you, and here you are. My bed is spread with lovely colored sheets of finest linen imported from Egypt, perfumed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come on. Let's take our fill of love until morning, for my husband is away on a long trip. He has taken a wallet full of money with him and won't return for several days." So she seduced him with her pretty speech, her coaxing and her wheedling, until he yielded to her. He couldn't resist her flattery. He followed her as an ox going to the butcher, or as a stag that is trapped, waiting to be killed with an arrow through its heart. He was as a bird flying into a snare, not knowing the fate awaiting it there. Listen to me, young men, and not only listen, but obey. Don't let your desires get out of hand. Don't let yourself think about her. Don't go near her. Stay away from where she walks, lest she tempt you and seduce you. For she has been the ruin of multitudes. A vast host of men have been her victims. If you want to find the road to hell, look for her house. That's plain speaking, but it's the truth. Now you might say, well, that's religious. That's the way religious people think. But I want to read to you the words of another man.